So we're continuing in today's Mishna Yomi, and today we find ourselves in Maseches Demai, Perek Dalid, Mishnayos Beis through Gimel, chapter 4, Mishnayos 2 through 3. So Mishnah Beis is an interesting case. Hamadir es chavero sheyochal etzlo, v'hu eino ma'amino ala ma'aser. So here's the interesting case. If you look at the Bartanur says, Da'amar le'koni mash'ata ne'aneli, im enata soid esli. So imagine the following case. Ruvain is marrying off his son, and Ruvain's making Sheva Brachas, and he wants his buddy Shimon to really come. And Shimon is hesitant. So Reuven says to Shimon, if you don't come to me for the Sheva Brachas, for Shabbos of Sheva Brachas, so ultimately, again, anything I own becomes prohibited in use or of benefit to you. So that's how badly Reuven wants his friend Shimon to come to Sheva Brachas. If you don't come, everything I own will be precluded from any level of benefit to you. So, but here's the problem. Shimon doesn't trust Reuven that Reuven properly tithes his produce. So what's the halacha? Ochel imo b'Shabbos harishona, v'afapi she'eno ma'aminu ala ma'isrus. So for the first week, right, for the first Shabbos after they get married, ultimately again, Shimon could eat by Reuven, right? Even though Shimon doesn't normally trust the fact that Reuven separates out Shumas and Maestris, as long as Reuven tells Shimon that he separates out Shumas Maestris. So again, what you begin to see is, this kind of goes back to last Mishnah as well, that we begin to see that Chazal, the rabbis, relaxed their decree of Demai when it causes either undue hardship or a potential for significant loss. So in this situation, there's a hardship, because if Reuven gets so breakers with Shimon that he doesn't come, that he's going to tell Shimon, you can't get any benefit from any of my property, that could cause problems for Shimon. And therefore Chazal said like this, okay, for the first Shabbos after the Chasana, you could go and have a meal with Reuven, as long as Reuven tells you that he did tithe the produce. As long as he tells you he did it, that's enough, that's absolutely fine. You don't have to do anything else. Now again, interestingly enough, often they would celebrate a Chasana for up to 30 days after the wedding. However, Ubishabbos Shnia, so actually the Bartanura says, so Shimon is permitted to go and attend the Suda. The Bartanura says, Hetiru lo la'achol imo mishum eva. Because if Shimon doesn't accept the invitation, it could cause some significant animosity. The rabbis allowed him to accept the invitation to avoid animosity or negativity. But on the second Shabbos, right, on the second Shabbos after the wedding, so in that case, again, we don't allow Shimon to eat by Reuven, unless, of course, Shimon first tithes all of the produce. Because again, the assumption is that passions run a bit higher in the first week after the wedding. But by the second week already, we assume that even if Shimon doesn't come, Reuven's going to be okay. And if Shimon does want to go, halacha l'maisa, he has to treat the produce like any other produce of an Amo Aretz, and therefore would have to tithe it before eating. Of course, again, remember, you can tithe on Shabbos. That goes back to the previous Mishnah. But halacha l'maisa, he would not be able to just simply rely on Reuven's assurance that Reuven did in fact tithe the produce. Very interesting. Mishnah Gimel, Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Ein tzarech adam likro shem l'maiser ani shal demai. Rabbi Eliezer says as follows: when a person purchases produce from an Ama Aretz, Rabbi Eliezer says, although he has to separate out certain tithes, he does not have to separate out maiser ani, which is the tithe that is given to the poor. Salach, remember again, halacha l'maisa. So maiser ani alternates with maiser sheni, right? So maiser ani is taken out on the 3rd and 6th years of the Shemitah cycle. Rabbi Eliezer says, we assume that even an Ama Aretz is careful with maiser ani, and therefore when you purchase produce from an Ama Aretz, you don't have to separate out Maiser Ani. You don't have to designate it, I should say. The Chum disagree. They say, Kol Reshem, Venosarach Lahafrish. No, you have to designate it. And ultimately, so again, the Bartanura says, by the way, in Rabbi Eliezer's position, V'lo nechshedu Amei Aretz al Maiser Sheni. Ultimately, again, because even the Amaratzim, even the ignorant, know to separate out Maiser Ani. And again, the Bartanura says, Shem Yodin Sheperas Atvula Maiser Ani Him B'Misa. Because if you go ahead and you consume produce from which Maiser Ani has not been taken, technically speaking, that is a Chi of Misa. warrants a death penalty. So the Anei Haaretz know this, and therefore they go ahead and they separate it. Therefore, you don't have to designate anything when you purchase this produce from an Aaron. So the Chum on the other hand say Kol Rishain, then it's Rak L'Hafish. This is actually very interesting. The Chachamim say you should designate it, but you don't have to separate it. Now here's what's interesting. Designating it at least allows you to go ahead and say that you designated it, but you don't have to separate it. The reason you don't have to separate it is because it's an interesting idea over here that technically speaking, there's a concept of hamotzi mechaver ala haraya. If you want to extract something from someone, the burden of proof is upon the extractor. In other words, like they say, like possession is 9/10 of the law. Well, that's true in halacha also. If I have possession of something, I am the rightful owner until someone else could prove otherwise. So the Chacham say like this: if you go ahead and you designate Meiser Ani, technically speaking, if the poor person wants to take it, he has to prove that in fact this produce was never previously tithed. Because remember again, we'll retithe it just out of concern that perhaps it wasn't tithed, but for the ani to actually go ahead and extract it from the current owner of the produce, he would have to prove that it wasn't tithed. So the Chachamim say that's effectively impossible. So therefore the Chachamim say essentially, go ahead and designate it, but don't separate it. Therefore you designate it, so therefore you kind of cover your bases, but you don't have to separate it, and effectively you're allowed to keep it, because halacha l'maisa, the ani, the poor person, would have to prove in a definitive way that the person from whom you purchased the produce never separated out meiser ani, to prove that he's entitled to now to that portion that you currently separated. And because that is impossible, you'll effectively be able to keep it and consume that which is separated as meiser ani. So the Chum say just designate, but don't separate. That way you go ahead and cover all of your bases. Excellent. We will stop over here for today. Shkayach everyone, wishing everyone a wonderful day. Tomorrow we will continue Mishnah Dalet and Hey.